Hello, this is Debbie Dwyer with Berkshire, Hathaway, HomeServices, PenFed Realty. I'm here today with Michael Frank Oliver and Company. We're once again addressing the contract.
Yay!
We are going through broker liability, broker fee, seller responsibility, buyer responsibility. So what is broker liability? The broker and their agents, subagents, and employees do not assume any responsibility for the condition of the property or the performance of this contract or any parties hereto. So the buyer and the seller are saying that they understand that the agents in this contract are just responsible for what's in this contract, and that's strictly it. Any outside information, any outside vendors, any other extra that they may have heard or taken advice from, they're not responsible for.
Right, I mean, it continues to say responsibility would be those except as written in the contract. So it's very, very clear, and I think the key here is, again, to understand that your agent is someone that you should trust to give you advice, not someone that you should trust to give you instruction, right? It's very important that you acknowledge that. It's a very short paragraph. I think a lot of people skip over it. Talks a little bit more about the fee that the broker would charge. And as the broker, if you could share with them kind of how that process happens and where that comes from.
Agents are paid through their brokerage. The way a brokerage gets paid is a couple different ways, but the main way is that there is an offering from the listing side, the lister, the seller, that they're going to compensate the brokers and agents who bring buyer and seller together and sell their home. So whatever that agreement is, in this paragraph, the title company settlement officer is then instructed to adhere to that agreement and disperse the funds as stated.
Simply put, every seller is going to have an agreement with their agent as a listing agreement. We know it commonly.
Right.
And every buyer should have an agreement in a written form called a buyer agreement. Without that, it's hard to get paid.
Right.
And the MLS, the multiple listing service, is going to reflect what the listing agreement says, but it does not dictate the buyer agreement. So it's really important that you as a client or as a buyer's agent or a seller's agent understand what your commission agreement is, because this paragraph is going to talk about collection of that agreement and compensation.
It also states that settlement shall not be a condition precedent to the payment of compensation. So if the agents to this contract and the brokers to this contract adhere to this contract, they're to get paid. And that's what this paragraph also says.
And I am going to advise you as a buyer, seller, listing, or buyer agent, talk to your broker. This is a really confusing section of the paragraph, especially when things go haywire. We're talking about everything falling down. I don't even want to interpret that, and I wouldn't interpret it for the agents on our team. We want to make sure we go directly back to our first source, and that's our broker. A little bit about the broker fee. It says that we're going to get compensated upon fruition, not necessarily upon settlement being precedent to the compensation. But what does that mean from a seller responsibility and a buyer responsibility? I always introduce my buyers and say, hey, you're responsible for following forth with the terms in the contract. If you miss a timeline, you've failed your responsibility. If you neglect to apply for financing or get approved for the type of financing, you've failed your responsibility. But how, for a seller, might that have impact for them?
So the seller also has responsibility. They have to keep their mortgage up to date. They have to make sure that there's no lien, an extra lien on the property. They have to keep their homeowner's insurance current. They also have to make sure that they allow access to the buyer and the buyer's probably inspectors to come through the property and to keep the timelines moving forward. There could be, scheduling. Of course, it is appointment only, but the seller also has to be reciprocal to allow the buyer to come in and do what the buyer needs to do to move this contract forward.
Let's say I was the listing agent, and a buyer's agent comes to me and says, tomorrow, we're going to have a home inspection. Right? It's within their right.
Right.
But tomorrow, I have my hypothetical children birthday party at my house, and I can't. Am I in violation of my responsibilities because I neglect to allow them? How does that work?
So I would say no, because it also, common courtesy is to have an appointment and not to say, I'm coming at this time. If we go back, and we'll talk later about those specific addendas, the specific addenda does say at an agreeable moment for the buyer and the seller.
Interesting. It's interesting to me that it's laid out here in the contract, but it's still somewhat up for interpretation. And I think the key for me as an agent and as a client, myself, as I go through the process, it's always looking back to my broker. How did this happen and how can we avoid this in the future? I think the seller's responsibility, a lot of people can rely on that by saying, well, my seller followed through, but perhaps they actually made it difficult for the buyer to follow through. And,
Right.
and again, it's very strict, but it's also open for some level of interpretation.
I would also say best practice, if the seller knows when contract is fully accepted and fully agreed upon that there is a conflict, to say, on March 3rd, I have a conflict.
Right.
If you would schedule inspections on any other day but that day. And that's good communication. And that's back to the very beginning when we talked about this in our previous episodes. Communication, communication, communication.
True. Always a good round out. So we'll talk to you guys real soon. We'll bring a lot more content, and I can't wait to get to those addenda where we could talk more in detail about these terms.
Great. Thank you.